Our today's topic is climate change. Previously, the year 1990 was the warmest, and the 1990 is the warmest decade on record. But the year 2015 has broken all the records, and every almost every month of it was termed the warmest ever. This shows that the Earth has warmed at an unprecedented rate over the last 100 years, and particularly over the last two decades. Exactly how much warmer the atmosphere gets will depend on how quickly and effectively people can substantially reduce the activities that are causing rising temperatures. The two main causes of climate changes. There are two main causes of climate change is natural and man-made. Sorry. The Earth's climate is affected by natural factors such as changes in volcanic activity, solar output, and Earth's orbit. Human activities that most affect the climate include the burning of fossil fuels and the conversion of land for forestry and agriculture. The Earth's climate is dynamic and constantly changing through a natural cycle. The natural variability and the climate fluctuations have always been part of the Earth's history, although there are a number of natural factors responsible for climate change. Some important of them are continental drift, volcanoes, ocean currents, the Earth's tilt, and comets and meteorites. Nearly 250 million years ago, all the continents made one large landmass known as Pangaea. Then they gradually began to drift apart and formed the separate continents. The formation of separate continental landmasses changed the flow of ocean currents and winds and isolated Antarctica. The position of continents and the continental drift had an impact on the climate because it changed the physical features of landmass, their position, and the position of water bodies. This drift of the continents continues even today. The Himalayas range is rising by about 1 millimeter every year because the Indian landmass is moving towards the Asian landmass slowly but steadily. Another natural causes of climate change is volcanic activity. When a volcano erupts, it throws out large volumes of sulfur dioxide, SO2, water vapor, dust, and ash into the atmosphere. Millions of tons of SO2 sulfur dioxide can reach the upper levels of atmosphere. It can be stratosphere. From a major eruption, the gases and dust particles particularly block the incoming rays of the sun, leading to cooling. Volcanic eruptions of high magnitude can reduce the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface, lowering temperatures in the lower levels of the atmosphere called the troposphere, and changing atmospheric patterns. Although the volcanic activity may last only a few days, yet the large volumes of gases and ash can influence climate patterns for years. Besides these two, changes in Earth's orbit also cause changes in the climate. The Earth makes one full orbit around the Sun each year. It is tilted at an angle of 23.5 degrees centigrade degree to the perpendicular plane of its orbital path. For one half of the year, when it is summer, the northern hemisphere tilts towards the sun. In the other half, that is the winter, the earth is tilted away from the sun. Changes in the tilt of earth can affect the severity of the season. Rules of oceans. In addition to these, the oceans are a major components of the climate system. They cover about 71% of the earth and absorb about twice as much of the sun's radiation as the atmosphere or the land's surface. Ocean currents move vast amounts of the heat across the planet. Since the ocean are surrounded by land masses, therefore heat transport through water is through channels. Further, ocean current is one of the natural causes that affect climate change. The changes in the ocean circulation will affect the climate through the movement of carbon dioxide into or out of the atmospheric. Now, role of human activities. Climate change can also be discussed by human activities such as the burning of fossil oils and the conversion of land for forestry and agriculture. Since the Industrial Revolution, human influences on the climate system have increased substantially. In addition to other environmental impacts, these activities change the land surface and emit various substances to the atmosphere. These in turn can influence both the amount of incoming energy and the amount of outgoing energy, and can have both warming and cooling effects on the climate. The overall effect of the human activities since the industrial revolution has been a warming effect driven primarily by emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Buildup of greenhouse gases. The buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has led to an enhancement of the natural greenhouse effect. It is this humans induced enhancement of greenhouse effects that is of concern, because going emissions of these gases have the potential to warm up the planet to levels that have never been experienced in the history of human civilization. Such climate change could have far-reaching and are predictable environment, social, and economic consequences. In South Asia, flooding, food shortages, and stagnating economic growth are just some of the devastating impacts that we may experience due to advancing climate change. According to the United Nations, the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report, Climate Change though 2014 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, states that climate change, in particular increased risk of floods and droughts, is expected to have severe impact on South Asian countries. The economies of the which rely mainly on agriculture, natural resources, forestry, and fisheries sectors. The report's conclusions and projections thereupon are stark and sobering. Even under the most modest assumptions about emissions growth, the future effects of the climate change will be felt worldwide, especially in South Asian countries Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Now, heat wave in Karachi in Pakistan context. These fears were further reinforced by a long heat wave in Karachi that claimed hundreds of lives. Scientists have warned for some time now that heat waves will become more frequent and intense due to climate change. Another manifestation of it came when Nepal suffered a massive earthquake in April 2015, which killed over 9,000 people. This quake was the largest one in the region in the past 8 decades. Soon after the quick earthquake, a debate ensured that it is the result of the climate change. The untold and terrifying story behind the earthquake reveals that it's the result of the ebb and flow of rainwater in the great river deltas of India and Bangladesh, and the pressure that puts on the grinding plates that make up the surface of the planet. University College London's Professor Bill McGuire, Professor uh, Emeritus of Geophysical and Climate Hazards, believe that climate change may play a critical role in triggering certain faults in certain places where they could kill a hell of a lot of people. Torrential rains in Chennai. Another fact. Moreover, torrential rains and the resultant heavy flooding recently submerged Chennai in India. In addition to loss of human lives, 3 million people were left without basic services, the cost of which is estimated at more than 225 million US dollar. Indian Premier Narendra Modi insisted, we are seeing the impact of climate change now. The unseasonal rains resulted in the floods in the Tamil Nadu. We have witnessed heavy rains in non-monsoon weather. And second is Montreal Protocol. When it comes to mitigation effort, we find that Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer was first such effort. It designed to reduce the production and consumption of depleting substances in order to reduce their abundance in the atmosphere and thereby protect the Earth's fragile ozone layer. The original Montreal Protocol was agreed on 16th September 1987 and entered into force on 1st January 1989. Considered a major multilateral success, the protocol is persistently touted as a prime example of how well nations can work together on global environmental issues. But why was it successful? The Montreal Protocol had the perfect combination of factors, hegemons, US and UK taking the lead. A short time frame before the ozone was projected to dissolve, a great mutuality of interests among the intending parties, and concentrated benefits with the distributed costs. And second one is Kyoto Protocol, the second big effort which came when, after 2.5 years of intensive negotiations, a substantial extension to the convention was adopted in Kyoto, Japan on 11th December 1997, and it entered into force on 16th February 2005 after 8 years. Under the Kyoto Protocol, most developed nations other than the US committed themselves to targets for cutting or slowing their emissions of a key greenhouse gases that cause climate change. The targets varied between nations. Some were allowed to increase their emissions by a certain amount, others were required to make significant cuts. The average target was a cut of around 5% relative to 1990 levels by 2012, or more accurately 2008 to 2012. Now third one is COP21 Paris Agreement. Another major effort on arresting climate change was seen in the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or CPO21, that was held at Le Bourget near Paris in France from the November 30 to December 11, 2015. After nearly 2 weeks of tough haggling for a climate rescue pact, representatives of 195 nations reached a landmark accord that will, for the first time, commit nearly every country to lowering planet warming greenhouse gas emissions to help stave off the most drastic effects of climate change. Commenting on the agreement, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, "This is truly a historical movement. For the first time, we have a truly universal agreement on climate change, one of the most crucial problems on the earth. The agreement, if faithfully carried out, will achieve far larger cuts in emissions than any previous accord. It will reduce, without eliminating, the risk that underway climate change might render parts of the earth uninhabitable. It will lessen it will lessen whatever the possibility of a collapse of one of the ice sheets, which would cause a rise of 20 feet or more in the sea. Now let's discuss the possible effects of climate change. In 2014, the US Department of Defense published the Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap, outlining defense and security issues in relation to climate change. The department warned that climate change was a threat multiplier, in that it stands to intensify already acknowledged security threats such as a scarcity, disease, drought, and displacement. Regions that are ill equipped to handle this onslaught of problems may be susceptible to the spread of extremism. It's no secret that climate change is expected to cause massive problems related to migration. People are already beginning to seek refuge with the world's first climate change. A family from the Polynesian island nation of Tuvalu, having been granted residency in New Zealand in 2014 due to rising tides. In 2014, a staggering nearly 60 million people sought refuge in other countries due to war, poverty, resource scarcity, natural disasters, and other problems, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Besides creating a perplexing refugee crisis, the climate change phenomenon is also threatening the food security. Climate change is likely to diminish continued progress on global food security through production disruptions that lead to a local availability limitations and price increases, interrupted transport conduits, and diminished food safety, among other cases. A major scientific assessment released by the US Department of Agriculture USDA indicates if society continues on a path of high emissions of greenhouse gases, there is no way around the fact that climate change is going to be a primary challenge for producing and distributing food. Pope Francis says we must not forget the grave social consequences of climate change. It is the poorest who suffer the worst consequences. Climate impacts have shown to hit the developing world's poor the hardest partly because they are more likely to be dependent on the very resources impacted, and partly because they have far less capacity to protect themselves. The phenomenon is already contributory to the death of nearly 400,000 people a year and costing the world more than $1.2 trillion, wiping 1.6 annually from global GDP by 2030. The researchers estimate the cost of climate change and air pollution combined will rise to 3.2% of the global GDP, with the world's least developed countries forecast to bear the brunt, suffering losses up to 11% of the GDP. Although Pakistan is one of the lowest emitters and accounts for less than 1% of the total global carbon emission, yet it remains at the forefront of the devastating impacts of the climate change. The year 2015 has proved to be an unusual one for Pakistan due to unpredictable weather events. A mini cyclone in Peshawar killed 44 people, heat waves in Karachi killed more than 1500 people, cloudburst in various areas of Gilgit-Baltistan affected 35,000 people, while floods across the country killed 238 and affected more than 1.5 million people. The climate change is having huge negative impacts on Pakistan, as well as several natural disasters, including floods and droughts, have threatened the agriculture and agri-based community of the country. The whole discussion can be summed up in the following words: if we want to address global warming along with the other environmental problems associated with our continued rush to burn our precious fossil fuels as quickly as possible, we must learn to use our resources more wisely, kick our addiction, and quickly start turning to sources of energy that have fewer negative impacts. Paris Climate Summit COP21. While the technocrats were shaking hands and congratulating each other on their exceptional feat, the UK witnessed its fourth major storm of 2015, which resulted in the flooding of thousands of homes and businesses in Cumbria, halfway across the globe. In China, Beijing announced its first ever red pollution alert as smog and has engulfed the capital. The concentration of poisonous particles went off the chart, and some businesses even went to so far as to charge customers extra for the privilege of breathing purified air. In the Philippines, Typhoon Nona caused cause killing at least 9 and prompting the evacuation of some 750,000. And in the India, Chennai witnessed the first floods in a century when the street of the 4 million strong city were turned into Venice-like canals. While the COP1 was a diplomatic masterstroke painstakingly organized by the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, getting 200 countries to agree on a non-binding framework will not single-handedly fix the planet's climate. We should remember that at the end of the day, what Paris gave was a 32-page document with lofty goals and little enforcement power other than the notorious fickle naming and shaming. The real work has to start now because, as the recent bout of extreme weather phenomena shows us, the environment cannot wait much longer. averting the implications of extreme weather events that results from the pumping of CO2 into the atmospheric requires much more than what individuals government have put forward in their pre-summit voluntary contributions. The INDCs, even if the government agreement mentions a commitment shared by close to 100 countries to push for a limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade for the rise in the global temperature, the combined plans to cut CO2 emissions put the world firmly on a 2.7-degree track. Environmentalists correctly pointed out that Paris will only provide the roadmap within which it will be up to individual governments and private companies to come up with solutions. unrest, unrest issues. The agreement left two big issues unrest. It is far from clear that of what the legal value of the document is and whether, as Nomi Kren correctly pointed out, existing trade agreements like the TPP and the forthcoming European Union US FTA TTIP will not supersede COP21 rules. However, while the future behavior of corporation is difficult to predict, what is not clear in the fact that in the run-up to the conference, so a collision of 2,000 financial institutions and individuals worth a combination $2.6 trillion agreed to pull the plug on any further investments in coal, shows that the private sector may very well toy government's line, which brings us to the second big elephant in the room: coal, and the biggest net contributor to CO2 emissions. Its dirtiness is only rivaled by its ubiquitousness. Germany's may lauded, lauded solar revolution is shadowed anew by increase in the coal plants. Republican-controlled Congress pledged to fight tooth and claw to protect the country's coal industry, while some developing countries trumped that their development can only be achieved by turning throughout the world's abundant and cheap coal reserves.